Okay? So the idea then is that I/O represents the type of instructions. Let's take another example, and that's the read file example. It's also a function with an argument, which is a file path, as we know, just a string. And it results in instructions for producing a string. Okay? And every time you apply it to the same file path, you will get back the same set of instructions. But of course, if you run the instructions, you get different things depending on when you run them and on what machine you run them. So the distinction between building the instructions and running the instructions is what allows us to think of Haskell as being a pure language. Now, the crucial point here is that who gets to run instructions? Is there a function called run instructions? The answer is no. There is no way of running the instructions from an arbitrary expression. The only way that instructions get run is if they are the top level value that is returned by a Haskell computation. So if the result of a Haskell computation is something of I/O type, then the runtime system will actually run the instructions. That's the only place where instructions get run, is when the I/O type reaches the top level. A value of top level of I/O type gets run by the system. Any question?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Did you have some kind of file path for standard error, standard input?
Yeah, so I'm going to talk about, in this lecture today, I'm going to talk about I/O, but only in a very superficial way, in the sense that if you were a systems programmer, you'd be very unhappy about what I'm going to say, because I'm not going to get into details. There are pretty big libraries about various kinds of I/O, where you can do all kinds of the things you might expect to be able to do with I/O. I'm really only going to barely touch on those. I need to just get across the basic concepts of I/O. So there are indeed various ways of getting a fine-grained control, having definitions for standard input, standard output, and so on. I'm going to use very high-level primitives which hide all the lower-level details away, but they are accessible in the libraries. Okay, so if, as in this case, we have some instructions which can produce a string, the question is, how do we get the string out of the result of this I/O? And the answer is you can't. There's no function in Haskell, in pure Haskell, which will take something of type I/O string and give you back the string that was in the I/O. And why is that? Well, if you could do that, you would break this purity that we have. You could have functions which run some commands and return a string, but if you run it on Monday when there's something in the file, one thing in the file, you'll get one answer. You run it on Tuesday, there'll be something else in the file, you'll get a different answer. And that'll be something which is hiding the fact that it's interacting with the outside world. So there's no way of hiding the fact that you've interacted with the outside world. So the only way to use the string that's inside the result of an I/O is by using it in the context of some other I/O. So we will see today building blocks for building things of type I/O, which would allow you to use the strings returned by, for example, read file. Okay, it's all a bit abstract, so let's actually do a little bit of coding, because I think it'll get a bit more concrete. Please ask questions as we go along. Okay, so we just looked at write file, and we just looked at read file. So if I, for example, read file, what was the file we had earlier? It was ex something or other, ex1.txt, and it contains the string that we expected. Now, what if I wanted to read the contents of one file and write it to another? You might think, well, we need to write file. Let's write to the file ex2 the contents of ex1. And what was that? Well, that was read file of ex1.txt. Okay? It doesn't work. Why doesn't it work? Well, the result of a read file is not a string. The result of a read file is an I/O string. Okay? In other words, it's a string which is obtained by interacting with the operating system. It's an instruction for producing a string. And as I said before, we can't just simply pretend that this thing is an ordinary string. It's not an ordinary string. So that means we can't apply this function, which is expecting a string as its argument. So we have to see how we can get around this. So this is the basis of what we're trying to do is copy one file into another. Now let's define that as an operation, a function called copy file. What does copy file do? It takes a file path for the first file, a file path for the second file, and produces instructions for copying the one file to the other. So that's the expected type of copy file. So what does copy file do? Well, we have to introduce our first non-primitive building block for building things of type I/O. We've seen a building block, namely read file and write file, which would result in things of type I/O or something. Now we need to see how we can put these together. And the simplest way we can put them together is by a bit of syntactic sugar called a do. So do, I'll start on the next line. A do block is a block, that is to say, an aligned sequence of expressions. Each of the expressions is of one of two types. They all involve something doing I/O in this case. So here we have read file. Copy file has two arguments. I forgot to name them. From file and to file. We read file from the from file. Now we need to do something with the result of this. So the result of this will be a string in the I/O type. So we need a way of naming that string. So the way we can do that is with the following syntax. The contents C, we get the contents C from the result of running this instruction. That's the first line. And then what we're going to do is to write file those contents into file 2. And I think I've got them the right way around. So now this is a program which consists of, it's a do. That means it's going to build something of type I/O. The first line does an I/O of string and gives the name to the string, calls the string C. The second line uses the string C to do some other I/O, namely something of this type. And the last line, the type of the last line is the type of the whole do block. Okay, so this is a sequence of lines resulting in something of, in this case, this type. And in order to get something of this type, the last line of our do block needs to have this type.
I have a question.
Yes?
Isn't C IO string here?
No, it's not an IO string because this is a special syntax that I'm introducing.
So that is converting from IO string to
It is, yeah. And you say, well, I just told you you couldn't get a string out of an IO string.
Yeah.
Well, the thing is that you are getting a string out of an IO string, but you're doing it inside a do. So whatever you do here with this string, the only thing you can ever return, because it's inside a do, will be an IO of something. So there's no way of getting this. I'm getting the string out locally, if you like, inside this do block. But I can only do it inside the do block. And that means the do block is saying, well, whatever you do with that string inside, the end result will still have IO on it. So the only place you can do this is inside the do block. And the do block then guarantees that there'll be an IO on the result.
And then write file can handle the C.
Write file, so C has type string. But the result, you can only use that string inside something of type IO of something. And that's because you can only use this operation inside a do block. And every do block in today's lecture will give you something of type IO.
But how else can I know that C have to be a string?
Well, it does type inference. That is, it looks at the evidence available from the program I've written to work out that it will be a string. For example, it knows the type of this is IO of string. That's one reason it knows that C should be a string. And what's more, it knows that the second argument to write file has to be a string. So everything matches and Haskell is happy. So the general syntax is that you have a variable and something, and so the type of the variable, let's suppose the type of the variable is A, then the expression here has to have type, so if the variable has type A, the expression has to have type IO of A. And the last line, the type of the last line will be the type of the whole result. In this case, it's an IO. Let's just try that out. Oops. If we reload that file, we can copy file, the contents of ex1, I'm going to make that into a string, into example 3. Nothing to see. Of course, when we read file, we can see what it produced. ex3, and it was indeed the original value that we had in file 1. Any questions about that?
What did write file return? An IO. We only call the write file.
The type of write file takes a file path, a string, does some I/O and returns nothing. So it's a, if we run it, it'll be silent. Yeah.
Could you return something like status integer or something?
Yeah, that's a good point. So in general, that's one of the things that the I/O library will contain is operations that will tell you if you're doing some interaction what the status of the result
What
is.
I mean is the function copy file, can we have a return type of int somehow and have this IO stuff hidden in there?
Yes, we can, but we would have to use, we're using very basic, simple I/O primitives in today's lecture. You'd have to dig into the I/O libraries to find the ones which are underlying these, and they're the ones that will return exit status for non-existent files and this kind of thing. Okay. So as I said earlier, in response to the earlier question about the details, we're not really going to dig into low-level I/O stuff. It kind of does the things you would expect. We're just going to keep things very simple today. Yeah. Okay. Any questions?